Hi everyone, my name is Kat and welcome back to the channel, Simple Music Theory, specifically right now focusing on simple music theory for guitar. We spent the last two videos talking about the major scale, so if you haven't watched those, you definitely should, because everything in this video I'm going to say with the assumption that you've watched and understood those other two videos. But in today's video, we're going to wrap up talking about the major scale, and we're going to spend some time talking about how to use the major scale to understand other types of scales. So depending on how long you've been playing guitar and depending on what style of guitar you're focusing on, for example, perhaps you're learning electric guitar and focusing on soloing, you've probably heard of a pentatonic scale, and maybe you've also heard of a minor scale. And so in this video, we're going to talk about how everything we've learned about the major scale can help you understand those other types of scales better. First things first. I know that I've said more than once that the major scale is perhaps the most foundational concept in music theory, directly above understanding note names and being able to identify what note you're playing. However, I've also said many times that you should not be memorizing a list of 12 scales, and you shouldn't be trying to commit to memory every note in every major scale right off the bat. You might be thinking, if both those things are true, then how am I ever going to progress in music theory? Won't my ability to move further in music theory and have a better theoretical understanding be limited by the fact that I don't know the notes in every single scale? Maybe you had that concern before. Maybe I've just introduced you to a new concern, but either way, I have two responses to that concern. The first response, as I said before, I'll say it again, and I will continue to say it for the duration of these videos. I am not recommending that you never memorize anything, and I am not saying try actively not to learn the note names in every major scale. I'm only saying that trust that time and repeated exposure will do a lot more to you internalizing the notes in these scales than sitting down for one afternoon for 3 hours and trying to get it all in your head through brute force. My second response, which is also going to play a big part in this video when we talk about using our knowledge of the major scales to understand other scales, is that it is far more important that you are able to understand major scales in the abstract than that you understand and memorize all 12 major scales and be able to talk about them specifically. We want to use the major scales universally rather than specifically. Whoa, what do I mean by that? This is a concept that's going to come up again and again in these videos, and that comes up as you progress further in your knowledge of music theory. But a lot of theory has to do with relationships between notes and patterns of notes rather than the specific notes themselves. So what do I mean in this context? I'm going to show you the notes that are in the C major scale, and I'm going to show you the notes that are in the G major scale. Obviously, they're different. However, the relationship of these notes to one another is the same because both of these scales were formed with the same pattern that we've been reviewing in these videos. All the notes in the C major scale were formed by starting on C and connecting the notes through a pattern of whole steps and half steps, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And all the notes in the G major scale are related in the same way. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So what we have with the C and G scales are two specific examples, iterations, if you will, of an abstract and a universal pattern. So if you start on any musical note and you follow the pattern whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, you will have a major scale. And the notes will have the same relationship to one another across all 12 of those different possibilities. And if I play a scale for you right now, and assuming you were not pausing and looking at my fretboard and figuring out where I was starting, and assuming you don't have perfect pitch, you probably could not tell me what major scale that was. I know for sure that if I was blindfolded and you played a major scale for me, I could not tell you what note you started on and what major scale you're playing. However, you could probably tell that it was a major scale because it kind of just had that familiar sound. And if I play a different major scale for you right now, okay, it's definitely higher than the last scale I played. And maybe at the beginning it sounded a tiny bit different. And if I played them closer together, the beginnings would have sounded even more different. But it's also kind of hard to tell, was that a different scale, especially because I let some time pass before I played them. And again, unless you're pausing and looking at my fretboard or if you have perfect pitch, it's kind of hard to say, oh, that was that scale. That's really tricky. However, you can pretty quickly identify, okay, I'm pretty sure both of those were major scales, because what your brain is doing is identifying that universal pattern and recognizing that the relationship between the notes that I'm playing one after the other is the same, even though the notes themselves that I'm playing are different. The effect that this has practically, especially for our discussion, is that instead of always talking about scales only in letters, which we've been doing up until this point, because we know that a scale is a universal pattern that has specific examples, specific iterations, but is a universal, we can also talk about scales using numbers. I'm sure that depending on how long you've played guitar, depending on what other videos and books you're using, I'm sure that you've seen certain concepts on the guitar expressed as numbers before, but hopefully this explanation helped really solidify why that's possible and why that's useful. But using the example we just gave, if we have a C major scale and we have a G major scale, in some of the conversations we're going to have in future videos, for example, about chords, instead of saying things constantly like, G major chord is made up of the notes G, B, and D, and a C major chord is made up of the notes C, E, and G. Those are really useful things to know, and those are things that you should know and are things that you practice, because over time you want to have that knowledge ready, like I just had it ready right now. But in our future discussions, like in the chord video, and then later on as we talk about how songs are connected, and in just a minute when we start talking about scales that are different from the major scale, instead of giving 12 examples of everything, we're going to be talking about these ideas with numbers, with the universal concept. So that way, when you go to specifically practice a specific song or a specific idea, you can take the universal concept that you have in your noggin and you can make it specific to what you're playing, and you can then practice the specifics. However, the overall concept is an abstract, and this is another thing about understanding over memorization. It is far easier to remember and understand and work with an abstract, and over time take steps toward memorizing the specifics versus memorizing a whole list of a bunch of specifics and never understanding how those parts fit together and what the big idea behind it all is. We have this universal idea of a major scale that we can describe using numbers instead of letter names. When we describe a major scale this way, we use the numbers 1 through 8, the first 7 being notes that are different from each other, the 8th note being the same as the first note, the octave. By the way, in the context of scales, you can also say degrees. So just in case you're accessing another resource and you hear them talking about scale degrees, same thing as me saying note in this context. It's just in the context of scales, you can say degree. There are also some fancy schmancy names for each of these numbers that kind of describe the role of that note in harmony, but that's beyond where we are right now, and not all of them are used super often. So we will talk about those fancy names so that you're aware of them, but we're going to talk about that later when we talk about how chords fit together in songs. Right now, I'm not going to give them to you, but just know in case you've heard scales explained this way before and somebody's saying a lot of big words that you haven't heard, just so you know, we're going to get to those too, but not today. Today, we're going to focus on the numbers 1 through 8. And we're just going to say first degree, or the first note of a major scale, second degree, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, which is also the octave. One other one I want to tell you about is the first note of a scale can also be called the root note or a tonic. And I don't feel bad about telling you those fancy names because root really makes logical sense because it's like the root of the scale. It's the start, it's the base. I wanted to tell you about universalizing scales, if we can call it that today, for 2 reasons. The first reason, as I just told you, as we progress further and further in music theory, it's easier and easier to talk about things in the abstract. These abstract patterns, not attached to specific notes. We're going to be using a lot more numbers. Don't worry, no big numbers. No numbers beyond maybe 15, I think, but numbers nonetheless. So first, I wanted to tell you about that today to introduce you to the concept. And if it doesn't make total sense today, don't worry, because we're going to keep coming back at this idea from different angles in future videos. But the second reason I wanted to talk about scales in terms of numbers today and scale degrees is because this is how I want to explain to you minor scales and pentatonic scales. We're going to start by talking about the minor scale. So just in case you haven't heard it before, here's what it sounds like. Whoa, so that definitely sounds different than the friendly little major scale we might be used to hearing. There are two ways of understanding different scales, like the minor scale. The first way is you could conceptualize it as a series of whole steps and half steps, just like we conceptualize the major scale. And that is perfectly valid. And in some ways you could argue maybe that's even more correct because there's no reason for the major scale to be the root of everything. There's no objective reason that that has to be the basis. However, in my opinion, that is too much memorization and that just has never made sense to me. For me personally, it's always made more sense to understand other scales in the context of the major scale. I just think it's easier to remember, and honestly, it strengthens my understanding of the major scale and how all these things are connected. So all that is to say, that's what I'm going to be showing you today. But if you ever read something or watch something that explains different scales differently, it explains them maybe in terms of whole steps and half steps, know that that's a valid way to conceptualize it too. That's just not the way that makes sense to me, so that's not the way that I'm going to teach you. Instead, I prefer to think of these scales as variations on the major scale. And the way that we can think about variations is we take those numbers again. I know you can do this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes, I knew you could do it. We take those numbers of the major scale again, and we make changes to those numbers. And maybe you've already guessed it based on other things we've talked about, based on your experience. The changes we're going to make is that some of those numbers are going to become either sharp or either flatted. So those numbers are going to be raised or lowered a half step. I'm going to show you an example of what I mean. There are different types of minor scales. Today, we're just talking about the natural minor as an example. And the way that we change a major scale into a natural minor is we use a flat third, a flat sixth, and a flat seven. So here's what that looks like with numbers. And now we have this universal, we have this pattern. We could have expressed it as a pattern of whole steps and half steps, but we're choosing to express it with numbers and with flats attached to those numbers. And now let's take that universal and apply it to specific note names. So we could choose any 12 of the major scales, but for simplicity's sake, let's use the C major scale. And that's also the scale that I played you before, the C minor scale. So if we remember what notes are in the C major scale, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, which again, we can represent as numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We want to flat the third. So we want to make E, what note is a half step below E? E flat. We want to flat the sixth. So let's count in the C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A. We want to lower A by half a step. So that's A flat. And then 7 is B. So we want to lower B by half a step. And now we have B flat. Do not memorize the minor scales today. That is not why I am showing you this. This is an example to help you understand how whatever scales you already are playing, you already are practicing, can be related back to the major scale, and how over time in future videos, when we talk about chords and we talk about songs and the keys of songs, all that information is going to relate back to this, the ideas that we're talking about in this lesson. If you play a song that's in a minor key, it could be super useful to sit down with the advice that I gave you before and play the key of the song first as a major scale because you have that pattern down pat now. So let's say you're playing a song in the key of C minor. You already know how to figure out the major scale, so you could start with that and play a C major. And then maybe you write down the universal pattern for the minor we talked about in this video. So maybe you write down in a notebook or on a piece of paper, 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 8. And then you could really push yourself and think about it and figure out how to play that on guitar. So I have the 1, that's the same. I have the 2, that's the same. Now, I want a flat 3. So before I was playing on the 2nd fret of the D string, now I want to flat it. Ooh, that's a flat 3. That has a really different sound. The 4 is the same. The 5 is the same. And now I want a flat 6 and a flat 7 and then back to 8. So back to the 1. Ooh, interesting. And that could be an example of a single exercise you do, and then you don't worry about it, forget about it, don't sit in a dark room and do that for 3 hours. But if you do that regularly with each of the songs that you play, take a minute or 2 to really focus, over time your understanding is going to improve so much. I want to give you one more example of applying this concept. We're going to talk about the pentatonic scale. Now listen, if you've never been exposed to the pentatonic scale, this is not the place to learn it. Honestly, you should just skip this and come back to it later, because if you've never played it before, I don't know how useful this will be to you. But if this is something you're already practicing because your teacher has shown it to you, you've seen it in another video, we're going to talk about understanding what you've already learned how to play and what you are already playing. So I'm going to play for you first the G major pentatonic. That's pretty cool. That definitely has a different sound than the major. We can understand the notes that are in the pentatonic scale, again, by thinking about the major scale. So if we think about the G major scale, that's a scale that has 1 sharp. It's the F sharp. The rest of the notes are natural notes. And we're also going to think about the numbers because we learned about using the numbers today. This time, I want to figure out what notes are in the G pentatonic scale using the knowledge I already have. So I'm going to play the position that I know. Again, if you haven't learned this, come back to this later. But if you know the G pentatonic scale in any position, if you've learned it, we can practice this together. You can play with me like Dora. So I'm going to start just on the first note. Okay, that's the 5th fret of the low E string, so I know that's A. So if I think about my G major scale, that's a 2. Okay, so the 2nd is in there. The next note I play is a whole step up from A, it's B. And if I think about my G major scale, that's the 3rd. So far I have the 2nd and the 3rd. Okay, that's the 5th fret of the A string, so I know that's the same as the next open string, so I know that's D. That's the 5th, so that's really interesting that the 4th was skipped. I guess the 4th is not part of the G pentatonic scale. Good to know. Okay, so we have the 2nd, the 3rd, the 5th, that's E. And if I think, or I have written down my G major scale, I know that's the 6th. Let's see what the next note is. It's the 5th fret of the D string. It's G. I guess that's all the notes in the G pentatonic scale. 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th. That's pretty cool. And that also makes sense because if you know what a pentagon is, then you know what the prefix penta means. And it's a pentatonic scale and it has 5 notes. The 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 6th. And we just figured that out right now. As a bonus challenge, if you really want to make me proud, you could now go and do the same thing with a minor pentatonic, if that's a scale you've played before, and see how the pattern is different. Whew, very exciting. Nonetheless, whether you already knew those scales and that was a great step in understanding for scales you're already playing, Or if you haven't played those scales in a musical context yet, but you just wanted to follow along and watch, I hope that those examples taught you something. In the first example, I gave you the universal pattern of a minor scale using the major scale as a reference. So I told you that a minor scale is the first, second, flat third, fourth, fifth, flat sixth, flat seventh. And then using a scale we've already learned how to play in previous videos, the C major scale, we were able to apply that universal abstract pattern to a specific set of notes and learn to play the C minor scale. You can do that with all 12 scales. In the second example, we took a pattern that you might already know how to play because you've learned it from a teacher from a video, and using our knowledge of the major scale, writing it down, looking at what notes are in it, and then playing the pattern you already know, being able to extrapolate from that specific example the universal pattern of the scales. So in this video, we learned how to do it both ways. We learned how to go from universal to specific, and we also learned how to go from specific to universal. That is so cool, and that is so useful, and that is so valuable to your playing, and those are two great exercises that you can do at any time with any scale. Let's summarize all the other awesome things we did in this video. All right, everyone, today we talked a lot about a concept that's going to come up more and more as we progress in these videos, and that's the idea of universalizing. In this video, we talked about universalizing scales. It's the idea of extracting patterns and relationships of notes in the abstract from specific notes and also applying those abstractions to specific notes. That sounded very fancy and complicated, but if you've made it this far, you saw what we talked about in the video, and hopefully that made sense. So first, we talked about how we can talk about major scales in terms of specific notes, but it makes it much easier to discuss major scales and later on other scales if we universalize those scales. So if we talk about them in terms of an overall pattern, an overall relationship of notes, we talked about applying numbers to the notes or the degrees of the major scale. And here I've written the numbers underneath two common major scales we've already talked a lot about. So in the C major scale, the 1 is C, and in the G major scale, the 1 is G, but they have the same relationship to the other notes in the scale, which is why they're both considered the 1. And the same is true of the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I've also written here, just to remind you, there are a lot of fancy names. We're not talking about all of them today. Those will be later. But two that do come up pretty often is the 1. The first can also be called the root or the tonic. And those are names that get thrown around a lot, so it's worth it to learn those now. Then, to further talking about this idea, and in case you've already played these scales and you want to really understand what you're playing and why, we talked about using the major scale pattern to understand other scales. So we talked about how the minor scale is the major scale with a flat third, a flat sixth, and a flat seventh. And we also used the example of a major pentatonic. And so we used a pattern that you might already know, and we figured out, for example, if we're talking about the G major pentatonic, we figured out that the major pentatonic is the first, second, third, fifth, and sixth of the major scale. Okay, everybody, this was our last video specifically about scales. As I said before, scales is such a foundational concept, it's gonna come up again and again and again. But in terms of the whole video being only about scales, this was the last one. So I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned so much. I hope that if you have any questions, you will ask me, because this is the first video that it really started to get kind of abstract. So I hope that if any of it didn't make sense, or if there's anything I can clarify for you, that you'll leave a comment and that you'll ask me so that I can help you and explain it to you. But this is a really exciting concept. I really enjoyed talking about it. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. If you enjoyed it, give it a like. And in the next video, oh, I'm so excited. I can hardly even stand it. In the next video, we are finally going to talk about the dream of every guitar player. The first thing that you learn when you start learning guitar, we're going to start talking about... Wow, that was the worst drum roll ever. We're going to start talking about chords, and I'm so excited to talk about chords with you because that is even more foundational to guitar than other instruments like the piano, which I bring up all the time. So until the next video, when we talk about chords, I will see you in that one. And if you want to know when that video is coming out, you better subscribe. Until the next one, guys, good luck practicing. Bye.